SECfans.com Week 13 preview shows. We're going to preview 3 games for this week. It is Thanksgiving week, so we are going to get them up earlier this week. It's Tuesday. You're watching this on YouTube. You're probably also, a few of you, listening on the radio, not the radio, on the podcast on the way to Grandma's house. So if you have forgotten that we put the audio up on the website, check it out, SECfans.com. You can download the audio direct. You can find us in iTunes, and that way you're not stuck with just YouTube and using up all your data for video. So trying to get these out a little bit earlier because we do know people are going to be on the road, and we do know that at least 8 people are listening every week. So got Husky in the house again, as always. I want to thank everybody for keeping with us this far. 13 shows. It's pretty awesome. This week we've got the Iron Bowl game of the week, number 15 versus number 1. But in the state of Alabama, it's 1A versus 1B for sure. Always a big game, that one. And then we got one more inside the SEC, LSU and Texas A&M. Had a rocky, mid-season for both of these teams, but this is an important game for a lot of reasons, and we're going to get into that. And then finally, going to step outside the SEC for Michigan, Ohio State, another huge game with huge playoff implications, and we're trying to see who's going to lose last to win the prize of not having to play Alabama in the playoffs. So with that, let's get into it. Alabama-Auburn, game of the week. Let's dive right in. There's no point in putting this one off. Huge game coming up. Auburn got some injuries that might slow them down in this game. You take a step back before the Georgia game, and the thought was Auburn might be able to win this game, win the West, win the SEC, and backdoor their way into the playoffs. And now, with the loss to Georgia, largely contributed to because of the loss of personnel, we're looking at a game that's lost a little bit of luster. I'm saying lost a lot. The luster's gone. There's an 18 to 20 point spread depending on who you ask. I think that might be a little bit ambitious since it's a rivalry game. So get us started. We've got a model coming later, but I just want to hit the high notes early on this before we get into the model. What are we looking at with these two teams? And tell us if Auburn's got a shot in this game. I want to give them their props and their due time on this. So if there's a shot for Auburn in this game, where will we see it? Take it away.
Definitely two teams that I think are kind of trending in different directions in a lot of ways. Auburn started a lot of people would say they probably started really poorly, right? With a loss to Clemson, and then close game, loss to A&M, and then close game win against LSU. I actually thought all 3 of those games were pretty impressive. A&M was playing much, much better. If you want to talk about a team, by the way, that's faded, A&M and Ole Miss, but Auburn played well in those 3 games, I think, in retrospect. You've got to realize Clemson is a very, very good team. They were at the time. LSU that Auburn played, I don't think was any worse than LSU is right now. I think Auburn made LSU look bad the same way Wisconsin did early in the season. And in the same token, Alabama kind of came hot out of the gates, the non-offensive touchdown streak. Defense was lights out for a few weeks, and then they've kind of, starting around that Arkansas game in the middle of the year, there were some issues with the passing game and defensively, and they've been a little sputtery. They sputtered the first half against Texas A&M. They sputtered the first half against Tennessee. LSU, the offense didn't work. Blew up Mississippi State, but considering that Samford and Arkansas did the same thing, I'm not really sure how much that's worth. And then you just had this past game against a UTC Chattanooga team that I will note, by the way, for any Alabama fans listening, I don't know how many people are aware of like FCS standings, but UT Chattanooga was number 2 in the FCS until they had a shocking loss to Wofford. But that's actually probably a team that would be competitive or could beat the bottom third of FBS. And Chattanooga's defense would probably be ranked about average in FBS. It's actually a very, very good defensive unit.
Yeah, and before you get into a little more of the Iron Bowl, I would like to touch on that game this weekend because Alabama fans are ready to jump off of buildings at halftime with it being 14-3, and Jalen Hurts having seemingly the one completed pass. I know he had more than that, but everybody's going to remember the bomb to Calvin Ridley. Talk a little bit about these games. I don't think that. Take a step back. A lot of times in these games, Saban uses them as scrimmages to work some stuff out. So they limit the offense, they focus on one thing, and they try to have a bunch of teaching moments, especially for quarterback. They've done that year after year. They did it this year against Western Kentucky. I don't think that happened here. I think the full offense was at Jalen's disposal and at Lane Kiffin's disposal. I think Jalen was just off last night a little bit, and maybe I'm wrong. Maybe before we get into the Iron Bowl, touch on that just real quick.
Yeah, I watched some of both of the FCS games. It's a little painful to watch these sometimes, but my impression from the Alabama game in particular was Alabama was trying to run that offense full throttle. You can complain all you want about not opening offenses up. I think if you want to say one thing that like makes me want to punch the drunken beer guy behind you that screams at the team the whole game, it's the why don't you throw the ball, open up the offense, throw it deep, blah blah blah. It's like, well, these guys are usually completely blind to the fact of how many of those are actually called, how often the ball is actually thrown on those plays, how often when they run those plays it ends up in a sack because it takes too long. That was that Alabama UTC game, like absolutely every second of it. Lots of downfield passes called, lots of stuff put on the arms of Jalen Hurts. He was asked to make a lot of. I didn't see. This was something I haven't really seen discussed a whole lot. I didn't see a lot of the like prairie dog offense in that game, right? Where they Lane Kiffin, like what he did with Blake Sims a few years ago, was constantly checking. Same thing that Auburn does with Sean White, with Rhett Lashley, and they've done with all under basically under Malzahn his entire career, where they change the snap, change the play call rather right before the snap. In Chattanooga, they really let Jalen Hurts run the offense, kind of tried to test, I think, to see whether he could make checks at the line like he's supposed to, make the right reads in the zone read game. Everything was predicated on him handling the ball and making a big play. The problem was, I think we saw why they limit what Jalen Hurts is asked to do. I think it's not in any way unexpected. I mean, he's a true freshman quarterback. There is a reason true freshman quarterbacks are not asked to, handle the ball every play, to make hard decisions. College offenses are very, very complicated. Um, and, this is an 18-year-old that's taking his first college classes and sort of getting the grasp of, how to do his own laundry. And you're asking him to memorize a 200-page playbook. Most teams, they set that 200-page playbook in front of the quarterback and they give him 3 years to learn it, not 6 months. So he is kind of where I think a lot of people thought he was, is where I kind of thought he was, in that he's a tremendous athlete with a tremendous amount of potential, but he just doesn't know all the plays. He doesn't know all the formations. And when he starts to run a lot of stuff downfield, because he doesn't have familiarity with the way the play is supposed to go, he starts just looking at how to generate it, right? He's running around kind of playing backyard football, looking for the open man rather than predicting where the open man will be based off the play call and the defense. And, the earlier part of that, looking for the open man with these mobile quarterbacks, can be very effective. But if you can predict where will be open, and, this is the difference, right, between Lamar Jackson and Deshaun Watson. It can be on a different level. With Deshaun Watson is a sharp kid that knows that offense backwards and forwards, and he is an unstoppable monster when he is on, because not only can he generate plays, but he's going to take any play available to him schematically, and then when it's not there, then he can create. Whereas Jalen Hurts is trying to create basically every play, and there are a lot of times where a big play is available to him, and he doesn't see it or he doesn't execute it.
So, one last kind of punctuation on that game, and as it relates to Alabama going forward, is this something where we should be worried if we're looking at Alabama in terms of carrying the water for the SEC in the playoffs, that if you can't score against Chattanooga without a couple of red zone fumbles and you manage 31, how are you going to score 35 on Clemson or Oklahoma or Washington? Is that what we're looking at? Or is it the same that it's been basically every year under Nick Saban, that you have these known limitations and you look ugly in a couple of these games, but when the lights come on and when you need the points, you find the points?
Hmm. I think it's more the latter. I don't know that they're going to find a ton of points. We've had,
But some of the
yeah,
former.
but some of the former. We've discussed this year with Alabama what kind of otherworldly level they've been in that. uh, I mean, to stop and appreciate, there's only been one game all season that somebody held them under 30 points, and that was LSU, right? That was the only game they scored less than 30 in a ball game all year, no matter what the production was. And they've had some 5.5, 5.8 yard per play games. If anybody does listen to the recaps, which I hope they do, and I hope people comment if they do, because we put time and I think they're really interesting. But LSU has yardage like that all the time, and they're scoring like 20 points. In LSU, Alabama, it's like, whatever. We'll find a way to score 40. It's absolutely crazy the amount of points they put up. The other thing I will say, and this is foreshadowing. We're going to end up with a video to discuss Ohio State, Michigan, and I think both of us are going to probably spend a fair amount of that video railing against the Big Ten. So if you hate the Big Ten, you should probably check that out as an SEC fan.
And last
But
week, too. We did it last week as
yes,
well.
yes, we did. It's well, it was Big 12, especially last week. It's just fun. But the reason we say that is I think the SEC is getting really beat up because of the level of competition, and more importantly, I think people are missing the lack of competition in a lot of the other conferences. And I'm not really sold that Alabama is going to face defenses that are all that good. In fact, Auburn's defense is going to be about as much a test as they're going to see. I think it'll be really interesting to see how Alabama handles Auburn and Florida, because I think Florida was the most difficult opponent they really could have drawn out of the East, because Florida can stop the run the same way that Florida beat LSU. It's the same. It's the same model you want to use to beat Alabama. Auburn is another team that beat LSU. Um, but again, Alabama does score points every which way, basically, except for that one LSU game where it's an incredibly hostile environment, night game, night CBS game in Death Valley, and there's no doubt that LSU coming off a bye was ready for blood in that game. But in the playoffs, Clemson has a pretty darn good defense. I don't think that's probably quite as good as the SEC's better defenses. I don't think Washington would just be good by SEC standards, not really elite. I think Ohio State can be, but as we've seen a couple times now, and you and I talked about that with Michigan State, they can get run. So the reason I'm saying all that, again, we'll get more into that in the Ohio State Michigan game. So Alabama fans in particular probably may be interested to check that out. I don't think any of those teams are going to pose quite as much of a threat. I don't know that they're quite good enough to shut Alabama down, just because I'm pretty skeptical of defenses
Well, as
outside
it
of the
relates to
SEC right
this
now.
game, I feel like you have a defense in Auburn that can play at the level that we've seen other defenses give Alabama struggles, especially something we've noted on the show. We catch a lot of flack for not universally singing Jalen's praises. And even as early as week 1 and week 2, we said there's some limitations there in the passing game. It seems like other defenses have started to game plan a little bit better for the things that he does well with his legs, and forces him to throw, and not just in the way that everybody knows, like, stacking the box, single safety, that sort of thing. They've done some other things schematically that have sort of limited Jalen. And I feel like Auburn is another one of those defenses that maybe not a ton of star power past the front four, which is actually really stout. But talk about how, because I think, going back to I'm going to answer my question to you. I think if there's a way that Auburn beats Alabama, it's forcing Jalen into some situations where he has been unsuccessful this year. And if they can limit Jalen Hurts in terms of, any kind of production at quarterback, which I think is a possibility, then Alabama might be in for a dogfight, even if Auburn has some issues on the offensive side of the ball.
Yeah, I think that's a fair statement. The way you stop Alabama, there's absolutely no freaking doubt. You stop them from running the football. I mean, this is it's going to look a lot. familiar to a lot of Auburn fans. It's the same sort of um, same sort of like dynamic run game. And it's easy to say, well, you just stop them from the run, stop them run one dimensional. But in the same way Auburn's been with Nick Marshall, it's not really one dimensional because it's so based off motion. It's running from the running back and the quarterback and lots of jet sweeps from the receivers. So they can be balanced without ever having to throw it, as weird as that sounds. However, there's been a lot of missing verticality. A lot of teams have played Alabama by just keeping a safety or two way back, daring Alabama to throw it, 10 to 30 yards downfield. And Alabama has, for the most part, not been able to oblige. Auburn is good enough to do that. Their front seven's very good. Montravius Adams has been a freaking beast in the past few games, and I think the loss of Byron Cowart's actually pretty significant, just from a depth perspective. I know he hasn't produced a ton, but he's a big, strong kid, and in games like this really matters. But the rest of that Auburn front seven, president, whatever. I mean, they generate a pretty darn good disruptive force, and that's going to mean that when Alabama's trying to get side to side, they maybe can't do that as much. Not going to be able to overpower at the line of scrimmage. And I think that's the thing that really gives Auburn a
So I
shot in
think
this ball game.
Auburn, is this a fair statement? Auburn, it doesn't match up as well in terms of their matchup against Alabama's offense as, say, an LSU did. It's almost like is it fair to say they're 85% of LSU's defense?
Um, to be honest, it's probably more like 65, 75%. And that's not a shot on Auburn before anybody feels that way. I don't think people appreciated just how freaking good LSU's defense really is. And even in the loss to Florida, right? I mean, Florida had 270 yards of offense in that game.
Right.
Nobody is moving the ball on LSU. If LSU had could just take an offense from pretty much any other team in the SEC, from Alabama or Ole Miss or Arkansas, doesn't matter. They are easily a national title contender. Their offense is elite. I mean, their defense rather is absolutely elite. I think their defense has maybe even exceeded expectations this year, to be honest. The problem is it is their offense, and I say all that to say Auburn is very good defensively. We're going to get into the numbers when we start turning in the model. I don't think they're quite as good as a lot of people maybe think they are. But as good as they are, you need to take a step back before you compare yourself to LSU, because LSU is almost on holy ground in a couple statistical categories.
I think Auburn's front four is probably up there with LSU. Probably not in depth, but with Adams coming on, and the fact that if you, I don't consider Arden Key as part of that front four because he's an outside linebacker and he plays a little bit in space. He's not rushing the quarterback every single play, but I do consider him in terms of disruption and getting to the quarterback. And I don't think he's as elite as people say. So I think the part that's going to impact Jalen Hurts the most, that front four, is up there with LSU. Maybe not quite there, but up there. I do think there are some second level holes that Alabama could possibly take advantage of. So I see where you're coming from on that good versus elite standpoint. But on the other side of the ball for Auburn is where we've seen the massive injuries. And right now, I think we saw after the Georgia game that, Cam Petway went down, and we saw how he went down in that game. And you and I said, we texted immediately, the way he went down, he ain't coming back this year. And Gus has not said that. Gus has kind of hedged on that. Week in, week out, he's saying, we're going to wait and see. I actually have heard from someone really close to the team that he's done for the year. That doesn't mean that that's the case, and I'm obviously not in any way some sort of, insider. Especially don't want to say that on the internet ranks, because if you claim to be an insider and you're wrong, then you certainly get killed for it. But I've heard he's not playing the rest of the year. I've also heard Sean White is out for, if not the rest of the year, at least till the bowl game. So I don't know if that's the case, but I will say in terms of this game and in terms of running backs, Johnson probably presents a bigger threat to Alabama regarding how they, the running backs that do give them trouble versus a Cam Petway. And I know that Auburn has kind of ridden him this year, but that's against defenses they can overpower and run between the tackles. Nobody this year has run in between the tackles. Auburn's not going to do it either. And that's not a slight on Auburn. Their offensive line is fantastic this year. LSU with Leonard Fournette and Darius Geis aren't running between the tackles against Alabama. Nobody's doing it. Where they have had some successes along the edges, and Kerryon Johnson can do that. But I don't think they can do that, and I don't think they can leverage him as an opportunity if they don't have a Sean White. Is that fair to say in terms of matchups?
I'd agree, and the reason I'll agree, it's less about Sean White as a passer and more about him as a runner, to be honest. And the reason I say that is if you have a running quarterback or somebody that's at least pretty mobile, it affects the way the defensive line has to play. They have basically the defensive ends can't rush upfield too much because on those sweeps or whatnot, if they're trying to follow the tailback and they rush upfield and the quarterback keeps it or whatever, they leave huge lanes right up the middle of the field for the quarterback to rush easily. Um, and Sean White was mobile enough that teams actually had to play him kind of honest. I don't think if Sean White's out and you're Jeremy Johnson. Well, first off, let me say that I have never understood why Jeremy Johnson was viewed as the like inside power zone read guy by
I don't think
Gus
Jeremy
Malzahn.
Johnson understands it either.
I mean, he has all the measurables for it, but there's no doubt, like whatsoever, if you watch him, that he's not comfortable running that style of offense. We talked about that, after the first game against Clemson. We were both pretty baffled. Sean White is a much more natural runner, but the other thing we've talked about with Sean White is he's also probably 5'10", 5'11", and probably about 200 pounds. So if you try to use him as a runner, he's not going to make it through a season healthy. He's just not big enough. But what he can do if you use him sparingly is to keep the other team honest because he can scramble if you give him open field. But as you said, I think Kerryon Johnson has a chance to get the edge a little bit on Alabama. But that only works if the linebackers aren't allowed to chase Kerryon Johnson side to side, and it only works if the defensive ends aren't allowed to pin their ears back. You got to have a presence of an inside run game to sort of hold the linemen, hold them in those A and B gaps to where they can't start rushing around and getting that C gap territory where they're setting the edge. And you have to have a downfield passing game such that the linebackers having to drop back in coverage, and that's a lot of things where losing Sean White really hurts you offensively.
So one more thing before we get to the model that I think is a really interesting topic for Auburn this year. Coming into the season, John Franklin III was hoped to be the Nick Marshall answer in terms of style of play and the ability both with his arm and his legs, and that hasn't materialized. But I think what a lot of Auburn fans have been wondering is, if we see we're not going to win the game, why not give it a shot? Why not put a package in for this guy? Let him run a few series against Georgia. And then we see, after Sean White goes down, that John Franklin isn't next man up. It's Jeremy Johnson. So what I'd love for you to talk about is why we haven't, what does it say about John Franklin III that we haven't seen that package put in, and why it could be a terrible thing if he's not capable to do the thing that I think some Auburn fans are going to say if Auburn loses this game in Alabama is, why not just push all your chips into the table and try to throw something crazy different at Alabama with the John Franklin III. Talk about how that could or could not be the best decision in the world.
That's another thing we discussed. If people that haven't followed us through the season, both of us watched that special on the junior college where John Franklin played. It was Last Chance U, and it was pretty clear from that and from his stats that John Franklin III has real issues as a passer. It was telling to me in the spring. I was a little surprised at all the hype because if you felt like pulling up the stats, you would clearly see John Franklin III was not the starting quarterback at that community college. And then, of course, everybody is now seeing that EMCC doc and now knows this fact. But John Franklin is somebody that I think was a project. They wanted to see how he would turn out. They got him on the team. They've worked him out, and I think probably by the end of fall camp, they already knew that they had a guy that couldn't really throw the football. And in the Clemson game and some of the early games, they've had some packages where they could use him as an off-tempo guy. But even in that Clemson games, I remember I don't think he even carried the football. I think they used him as a decoy, and maybe I'm misremembering that, but I think that's the way that went. So they were well aware that he had issues, but it's not. It's everything in ball handling.
He did
Because
not
there's
have a carry against Clemson.
okay, so I am right there. Yeah, he not only do I think he has serious issues with accuracy throwing the ball, and it's footwork, it's arm delivery, it's everything. He's just not in any way an accurate passer. He's also a fumbler. They put him in against Vandy, and the moment they tried to really run him, he had the ball like a loaf of bread and fumbled the football. So you can't trust him to throw, and I don't know that they really trust him to run in traffic. I think they need him. They are happy to use him when he could get the edge, but I think they're scared even just running the football with Franklin that he's going to fumble a game away. So they gave him a shot against Vanderbilt, which they probably thought was going to be an easy-ish win, and they knew that there's a huge athleticism gap where they could probably maybe get some advantages. But they're really scared, I think, to give him touches. And the interesting thing from that perspective is you can talk about moving him to another position, but if you don't trust him to handle the ball, even just fumbling it, you can't even use him as a receiver or a running back until that gets corrected. So I think he's an intriguing prospect, and I think he could be a phenomenal talent. I question for what I've seen passing if he can ever play quarterback. Honestly, I think he may be an NFL. He has elite speed and he has a pretty good frame. I think he's probably an NFL player at some other position, but I don't know that he's going to be a quarterback, and I don't know that we'll. I don't really see him being much of an option other than a pure desperation change of pace guy in this ball game, just because of the ball security issues.
And I think we saw everything we needed to see in regards to that, in terms of whether or not they're going to put a package in for him against Alabama, when in a 55-0 win versus Alabama A&M, John Franklin III had 0 passes. He had 4 rushing attempts, 81 yards, of course, we know, super fast, had a touchdown, but he didn't throw it a single time. So if they were going to put something in for him, they would give him some reps under the cover of blowout to get him comfortable with that. I cannot see them putting him in as a surprise when he clearly hasn't been able to execute in practice. I can't see him executing against Alabama. I do think if Sean White can't go, Jeremy Johnson is their best bet. And you and I have talked about it before. Jeremy Johnson is actually a good passer. He's got a good arm. He doesn't make the best decisions with the ball all the time, but there are times when it can click for him. So I don't know that it's. I mean, he had a nice bomb against Alabama last year, so I don't know that it's completely lost if you put him out there. I just don't think he brings like you said, the running element that Sean White does. So all that super long lead in to our computer model for this game. So I'm going to shut up and let the model do the talking. And so why don't you tell us what it says?
Right. Alabama and Auburn are two teams that both sport very good defenses and are both predicated on the run. So the first thing you want to look at really is the rush defenses, and the relative strength of the two defenses. For those that are unfamiliar with this model that I run and the way it works, it's sort of twofold. First, I try to take the data on a per play sense to say, what are the average per play production of all the different opponents everybody's playing, both splitting up not just rush, but run and the pass game from all their opponents. And how does that really stack up defensively to what the teams have done? In other words, it's one thing to say Auburn holds their opponents to it's 3.6 yards per rush and 6.3 yards per attempt, which are good statistics. But what does that really say in comparison to their opponents' rush averages and pass averages? As it turns out, if you look at pure statistics and compare them side by side, Auburn does not look that much worse than Alabama defensively. And I almost hate to say worse because they're both very good defenses. Alabama's holding teams to a flippin' crazy 2.16 yards per carry. And I have no comment on that because if you're holding them under 3, you get that falling forward. So basically, the average play gets to the line of scrimmage and falls over.
And for the
But
people who are listening to the podcast and can't see it, it's also worth touching on their ratio allowed. So talk
well,
about
I am
Alabama's
going to get to
ratio.
that. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm going to get to that. So you say 2.16, and then but Auburn's holding teams to 3.61 yard per carry, which is also really freaking good. But the thing that we do is we step further than that, and that's where I was getting before I was so rudely interrupted just then. But no, it's the ratio, right? As it turns out, Alabama's opponents, both passing and running the ball, are actually unfortunately significantly better than Auburn's. So not only are they so darn good in a per play sense, they've actually played good teams. I mean, their opponents are averaging 5 yards a carry. Auburn's are averaging right about 4.5. So in a percentage chance, whatever you average rushing, Alabama is going to give you 44% of that. That's nuts. Because if you think about it, if you're averaging 6 yards per carry coming into an Alabama game, you're going to get less than 3.
What's a good defense ratio? What's a good
Right.
number?
Okay. Yeah, we've discussed this. It, if you're in a major conference, your number should be pretty good percentage wise. It should be under 100%. If you're over 100%, you're a bad team because there's enough Arkansas States and Western Kentuckies and Louisiana Monroes that it boosts that number quite a bit. But a good team is really anything over 90, I would say. And a great team sits usually between 80 and 90, or maybe about 85 to 90% of allowed averages. Anything time you start getting under 80%, you start getting into the elite category, particularly if you can get under like 75. Alabama's at 44. It is such a crazy low percentage number. I don't have any example of a team giving up 43% of opponent averages. Last year's team, I think, was something like the 50s. Even some of the other great, Bama teams I do these models a lot for, the big games every week. I don't think I've ever seen a team, at least in my memory, that's ever been in the 40s. It's absurd. And then Auburn's is actually their rush defense is giving up 80% of opponent averages. So I think a lot of people would say that Auburn's rush defense is pretty good. Alabama's defense is giving up half of whatever Auburn's does. It's like another level. Auburn at 80% is good to maybe even great. Not, we talked about LSU and Florida. LSU is phenomenal at 67%. Florida is giving up 78%. So both of those are a little bit better than Auburn. LSU, we talked about that in our recaps, right? LSU's actually faced some really good rush defenses. Doesn't quite get the credit they deserve. They're a little bit of a different level than Auburn. Auburn's still very good at 80%. Stepping over to passing ratings, again, 5.8 yards per attempt for Bama, 6.3 for Auburn. Pretty close, and a lot of people will just look at the stat line and end it there. But again, Alabama is seeing teams that are averaging about a half yard per attempt more. And so when it comes out as a percentage, Alabama's given up 77% of opponent passing average totals. By the way, they were in the 80s earlier this year. We've run a couple models. Let me see. They were at 84% when they played Tennessee. We ran a model for Alabama, Tennessee, so they've actually improved substantially in the second half of the season. Auburn has given up 89% of opponent passing totals, and that's another one that's interesting because just the Ole Miss game they were at 85%, so they've dropped from 85%. Now they're climbing back up to 89, 90. They're not really a great pass defense anymore. They're really just a good one, and they're declining. I talked about these teams going in different directions, and I said we'd sort of see it later. And this is why Alabama's pass defense to start the year was 84, 85%. Auburn's was 84, 85. They were about equal Auburn's has progressively gotten worse. Alabama's has progressively gotten better, and now Alabama really supports an elite pass defense, and Auburn does not. And that's actually probably one of the defining characteristics of this football game. Is not as much as we want to talk about the run, because both these teams are focused on the run. It's the fact that the pass defenses are kind of going in different directions, and the injury to Halsey will not help in that regard if he does not play Saturday. So
So I think, and we're going to get into what the score says, but I think what's interesting about this is at some under a certain threshold for an opposing defense, given how much a quarterback means to any team, I don't think Auburn has to be an elite defense to really give Alabama trouble. And it's almost like as you approach zero, you don't have that much differentiation between the two. So if both teams are forcing 3-and-outs, constantly, any play here or there could be huge. So talk about what we've seen here are a really good defense and an elite defense. I think that's fair to say. But a little bit, we don't touch much on scoring averages when we do these models. Talk about that a little bit before you get into the actual prediction of the score.
sure. Again, this model is not in some ways very complicated. I try to keep it simple because I don't want to inject any of my own subjectivity to it, right? I want to run the model, the same way every time so that I have a decent result. And I'm trying to do this to say, really, if Alabama plays their average game and Auburn plays their average game, what does that look like relative to each other? And to do that, I do try to generate a score because people tend to want to know who's going to win the ball game. That involves points. And to make that happen, I look at points in relation to per play averages. And what I mean by that is, again, I have to throw out total offensive tempo to a large degree because total offense is so dependent on the tempo of the team. If you're playing two up tempo teams, are going to play 100 plays and they may generate 700 yards of offense, and then you may have two, like Florida LSU, they may only run 60 plays and they'll generate 500 yards of offense. Well, 500 yards of offense in 60 plays is really a lot better than 700 in 100 plays, as weird as it is to say. Um, and so what I say is the higher your per play average is. So if I'm average, if you average 6 yards per rush or 4 yards per rush or 8 yards per rush, I feel like it should probably correlate to the point production you have. And I plot it basically on a graph. And the higher, and it's pretty consistently true, the higher your per play production, the more points you score. It's Auburn's three best games are the three games they averaged over 8 yards of play: Arkansas State, Louisiana Monroe, and Arkansas. Auburn's, you know, worst games are the games where they didn't average 5 yards per play. When they were held under 5 yards per play, that would be Clemson and Georgia, 7 and 13 points. And then everything in the middle sort of falls right into place. Next highest game, A&M, also the next highest scoring. Next highest per play average, LSU. So like the six worst game in order, if you look at the six worst yard per play games by Auburn, they match exactly to the six lowest scoring games by Auburn, and in a pretty good curve. And that's what I use as a predictor. And so I run all this math to basically see how many yards per play are you going to get. And I look at the other games and say, with this many yards per play, how many points do you get? And one of the big storylines this year is actually the fact that Alabama, it doesn't really matter what they do. They still score 40, 50 points. And then some other teams, LSU and Auburn in particular, their point total varies wildly. When their per play production goes up, their offense shoots up really predictably. And when their per play production goes down, the offense completely stalls. And so that's the way I fix scoring into it. I mean, is that a fair answer, you think?
Yeah, I think so. I just think sometimes we focus on the defensive averages and we don't really talk about the yards per play. And I thought they were interesting, and you actually touched on that, on how varied Auburn's has been this year and how interesting it is that theirs is almost an exponential growth curve related to their yardage where others aren't. Like even in LSU that you talked about, we've seen LSU put up a lot of yards and not a lot of points, where Auburn's is almost in lockstep with those yards per play. They seem to really take advantage of that. So with that, let's get into what the model says in terms of score, because like you said, what's on the scoreboard is what people find shockingly the most interesting at the end of a game.
Yeah, it was it Yogi Berra said, what's the key to winning this game? I think we have to score more points. Yeah, the end of the day, Alabama's offense, Auburn's offense, actually pretty similar. Alabama's a little more productive in the run, a little more productive in the pass, but Alabama's defense is freaking dominant. Auburn's defense is very good, but not quite to the same level. And the way all that balances out, when I crunch the numbers, Alabama only giving up something like 65% on average of opponents' averages. Auburn giving up about 85%. That 85% number is enough where teams can still sort of run their offense. The 65% number from Alabama continually is enough that it breaks teams. As we said in this game, Auburn is very much in lockstep with the per play production. So I anticipate this matching the model. That's the trend, is that the model here should actually be quite accurate for them. Alabama's offense is predicted to have 5.9 yards per play. That's pretty high. And that's lower than Alabama's had, by the way, in most games. And that's an interesting sort of no man's land, because their SEC games have generally been over 6, or with the one exception of LSU where they were under 5. But it's probably similar, maybe a little bit better than the Texas A&M game. That's the per play average. It's predicting. Auburn on a per play sense is predicted to have 4.3 yards per play. That would be the second lowest output of the season. Worse than Texas A&M. Well, I say third. I guess it's third worst. It's better than Clemson, worse than A&M. Better than Georgia, Clemson, worse than A&M. And that's taking the whole season into account, by the way. And if you plot that based off per play production, that gives you a score of Alabama 31 with 5.9 yards per play, and Auburn with 4.3 yards per play, 14. So the model there's Alabama 31, Auburn 14. Um, and I think that's probably decent. We say a lot, right, that we kind of look back at our model and say, how does it compare to Vegas? Because Vegas is pretty darn good at setting lines. We're saying Alabama by 17. Vegas has set the line as Alabama by 20. And again, this right, and they opened at 18. So this yet again, this is pretty consistent with Vegas's lines. The one caveat to all this is the injury situation. I'm looking at these predictions based off, weighting every game equally across the season. I personally think you have to do that because teams, the schedule varies so much in difficulty that a lot of teams, people feel like they're on a run because they just played 4 really weak teams. I think that happened to LSU, by the way. They played some really terrible run defenses, scored a million points. Everybody thought Orgeron was the greatest guy ever. Now they've played some really good run defenses and they look terrible. It's just the product of the opponents. But the reason I think the line has moved a little further is, we've talked about this before, but I don't think even the Cameron Petway, the Sean White injury, I'm not sure the most important injury isn't Chandler Cox at fullback. Formationally, everything Auburn does is designed to keep an offense off balance. So, they're at their best was probably around that 2014, 2013 year. They had Uzuma and Foles, especially when they had Prosh. But what it let them do is they could line up with Uzuma and Foles in a 4 wide set with those guys split wide. And you really had to be in a nickel or dime set to defend that properly. And so if you put a nickel or dime set on the field, he would, the quarterback, Nick Marshall turns to the sideline, Malzahn makes a signal, Uzuma Foles come back in the backfield, and now you're in a, you're facing a old wishbone look, or you're facing a real heavy power run look. Well, you just put your nickel defense on the field to defend what you thought was going to be a 4 wide set, and now you're facing a power run with 265-pound tight ends acting as fullbacks. And that puts a tremendous amount of strain on the defense, because whatever you do, if you go standard set, then they're going to spread you wide and you're not going to have the right personnel in coverage. And if you go coverage, they're going to bunch up and go run, and you can't ever really adjust. Without Cox and without those tight ends, which they really don't have this year, they don't have that flexibility. They only have a limited playbook. I really think when particularly that Georgia game in the second half, we talked about that in the recap. When Cox went out, there were a tremendous number of power run plays with the lead blocker with Cox that were really, that were the bread and butter, that they were continually having Cox blow up the linebacker or blow up number 18 for Georgia, who's like 165-pound sophomore, probably should be on the field. And they were just getting the edge every time. When Cox came out of the game, they don't have, they're going to go to a walk on at fullback if they use him against Alabama. And I have no doubt that he wasn't ready in the Georgia game. So there's a whole ton of plays that just came off the table. And all the stuff they did with Cox, where they're starting in a passing formation, moving to a run formation, they can't do that. They now have to stick to whatever plays don't use a fullback, which are mainly passing plays with the zone read element. They don't have those lead blocker run plays on the table. That's not what they're very good at running. It's not really Sean White's strength. It's not the offensive strength. And that killed them. And it's a formational issue. I'm not saying Cox is really, necessarily that important as a player. It's what it lets you do formationally. It's the style of offense it lets you run and the versatility that gives you that's done so much damage. And, I think we may see the same thing. They've got to, unless they put the walk on the field, and I'll be curious to see if they do it. If they don't, now they have to be more like what they ran. Really, they have to go back to 2015 Auburn, and they have to be 3 and 4 wide sets with a tailback, Kerryon Johnson running the zone read with Jeremy Johnson. And that means Jeremy Johnson probably has to be the inside read power guy because Kerryon's not big enough. Kerryon's the outside run guy. And that is a long way from Cameron Petway running the quarterback, running the, halfback power, following a fullback off the B gap. It's a totally different style of offense. And the real shift, it's not Cameron Petway that's changed it. They could run those plays with Kerryon Johnson. The issue is they don't have a fullback or tight end to run that power play. And I think that big thing, not to mention the defensive injuries, and I think Halsey could be a big deal. And then, Williams at linebacker, they really struggled when he went out a couple times this year too. It, I think that's why we've seen the line grow from what this model is predicting.
And for me, if I'm picking a score on this, I think both teams have trended down recently from what a model would predict based on per play averages. For Alabama, I think defenses have adjusted a little bit to Jalen Hurts' inability to see the whole field, and make plays with his arm, and they've adjusted to his ability to run the ball. For Auburn, I think that there's no model that can account for the devastation that they've had on the injury side of the ball, which is really unfortunate because this could have been, and it still can be. I'm not dismissing this game. I think everybody should watch it. It's a hugely important rivalry. But I really think Auburn could be staring at an opportunity to be competitive in this game and backdoor their way into the playoffs had these injuries not occurred. And people are going to think that's crazy because they've played some ugly football this year. But Auburn had the type of team that could give Alabama trouble, especially on the defensive side of the ball, and maybe find a way to win. And then, given everything else that's happened this year, that's not an unreasonable scenario. And people are going to ask, because we've spent a lot of time on this game, and they're going to say, you've spent more time on this game than you have other massive games earlier in the year. And I think it's important because not only are we towards the end of the year, and it's probably the biggest game in the SEC this weekend, but people don't realize how big of a rivalry this is to Alabama, the state of Alabama. And I know we've got a lot of out-of-state podcast and YouTube listeners checking this out right now. I want everybody to think about how when they talk about greatest rivalries in football and in sports, they need to remember that these two fan bases have only college football all year round. They don't have, like, take an Ohio State and Michigan. They don't have pro sports to distract them. They don't get to go to their separate corners in their own echo chamber of talk radio in their own home state. They have to live with each other 24/7. And oh, by the way, there are no distractions. It is college football year round. And these are two super passionate fan bases. So we're spending a lot of time on this game because this game matters. This game matters if both teams were unranked, it matters if it decides the West or the national champion comes through this game, which has happened, seemingly every year for the last 10 years. So, kind of a rant on that, but I don't think people realize how important this game is, not only is the state of Alabama, but the landscape in college football in general. So I'm saying 23-10, which is just a slight trend down from the model. 23-10 Alabama. Every week we have you give your model score, but also give your gut score. So your model says 31-14. Why don't you round it out? Finish this one up. Tell us what your gut says.
I think 24-7. I think the margin's fair, but I don't. We've talked a lot about per play averages and all this crap, and hopefully we didn't lose too many people in the stats. But we talk a lot about the fact that once your per play averages start trending down, particularly if you're a run based team, offenses do stall a little more than you expect. I think these defenses are good enough to do that, and I don't think we're going to see as much offense. 24 points, by the way, that would be the second lowest total Alabama's held all year, and I think that probably does happen. But I just don't think Auburn's going to hardly score. I think they'll have one big play at some point. Jeremy Johnson has the arm to do it. I thought Johnson, honestly, was the better quarterback going into the year. I think Sean White has been the surprise of the season with how much he's improved. But yeah, give me Alabama 24-7, right about a 17-point lead. And if anybody feels like that's, I'm actually saying that Alabama doesn't cover here. So I mean, I'm actually giving some credit for Auburn. It is what it is.
And that might even be a little more of an uncomfortable score for Alabama fans, given what we just saw with Chattanooga. They probably want a blowout here, and I just don't think it's going to happen. I think Auburn's defense is too good. So that, I think that puts a bow on that game. I hate moving on from it because it's such a great game to watch every single year, and I know I'm gushing about it even still, but it's just an important game, y'all. So you need to watch it.